The call came late in the evening, the kind of hour when news rarely arrives gently. I remember looking at the phone, seeing my son's name, and feeling a flicker of relief. We hadn't spoken in a while, and I told myself this was a good sign. Maybe he was calling to share something happy, something ordinary, something that would close the quiet distance that had grown between us without either of us admitting it. I answered with a smile in my voice that didn't match the tension in my chest. He didn't waste time with small talk. His words came out fast, rehearsed, like he wanted to get through them before courage ran out. He said he was getting married tomorrow. Then he paused. Then he said he had withdrawn all the money from my bank account. For a moment, my mind refused to connect those sentences. Marriage, tomorrow, my money gone. I felt as if the room tilted slightly, not enough to knock me down, just enough to remind me how fragile balance really is. I asked him to repeat himself, not because I hadn't heard, but because I hoped I'd misunderstood. He didn't repeat it. He explained it instead, calmly, efficiently, as if outlining a necessary step in a plan I should already understand. He said it was temporary. He said it was for their future. He said I wouldn't need it right now anyway. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. I sat there holding the phone, realizing that something far bigger than money was being taken in that moment. Trust doesn't leave all at once. It drains quietly, like an account you stop checking because you assume it's safe. I had assumed safety. I had assumed that love created invisible boundaries no one would cross. I had assumed wrong. What hurt most wasn't the loss itself. It was how normal it sounded to him, as if this was simply how things worked. As if I would understand because parents always do. While he talked, my mind drifted backward through years I had never examined closely. The times I said yes when I wanted to say no. The times I stayed silent to keep peace. The pride I felt providing without conditions. I had confused generosity with immunity. I thought giving freely meant no one would ever take freely. That illusion shattered quietly while my son spoke about wedding logistics and future plans that didn't include asking. I realized then how rarely we prepare for betrayal when it comes wrapped in familiarity. We expect harm from strangers, not from voices we once soothed to sleep. We don't imagine that love, unmanaged and unspoken, can become entitlement. My son wasn't cruel, he was practical. That almost made it worse. There was no anger to argue with, no apology to cling to. Just a decision already made, justified by urgency and love for someone else. When the call ended, the silence felt loud. I sat alone, staring at nothing, replaying his words, searching for the moment where I should have interrupted, should have objected, should have protected myself better. But the truth was uncomfortable. The moment had come long before that call. It came every time I avoided difficult conversations. Every time I chose short-term harmony over long-term clarity. I had taught him many things without realizing it. One of them was that my boundaries were flexible, even invisible. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was calculating numbers, but because I was confronting a story I had believed my entire life. The story said parents sacrifice and children appreciate. The story said family means shared resources without question. The story said love would naturally guide behavior without the need for rules. No one tells you that these stories only work when everyone reads from the same page. When one person changes the script, the others are left unprotected. By morning, the shock softened into something heavier and more useful. Awareness. I began to see how often people confuse obligation with closeness. How easily financial support becomes emotional leverage. How silence, meant to be kindness, slowly becomes permission. This wasn't just about my son. It was about a lifetime of assumptions finally demanding payment. I knew then that whatever came next would define more than our relationship. It would define how I lived the rest of my life, whether the first would retreat into resentment or step forward into clarity. Whether I would see myself as a victim of circumstance or an active participant in my own future. Pain doesn't ask permission, but meaning does. Meaning requires choice. That call was the end of one version of my life and the beginning of another. Not because of the money, but because illusions had expired. When that happens, you can either cling to them out of habit or let them go and learn to stand without them. I didn't know yet which path I would take. Only that nothing would ever feel simple again, and that maybe simplicity had been the lie all along. In the days that followed, I moved through my routine as if everything were normal, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. Simple tasks took longer because my thoughts kept drifting back to that phone call, replaying it from different angles, searching for a version where the outcome changed. I checked the bank statement even though I already knew what it would show. Seeing the numbers reduced to almost nothing didn't shock me the way I expected. The shock had already passed. What I felt instead was a dull awareness settling into place, the kind that doesn't scream but stays. I told myself not to react impulsively. I didn't want to become the angry parent who uses guilt as a weapon. I had seen that dynamic play out in other families. poisoning relationships slowly until no one remembered why they were still fighting. But restraint doesn't mean denial. I had to acknowledge what happened honestly. My son hadn't asked. He had informed that distinction mattered. It meant the issue wasn't just money, it was power, and how easily it shifts when assumptions replace agreements. I started asking questions I had avoided for years. Why had I kept everything so vague? Why had I believed that talking about finances would somehow cheapen love? I realized that I had treated money as a symbol of care instead of a practical reality that needed boundaries. In doing so, I removed myself from the conversation entirely. I left decisions to chance and trust without structure. That may sound generous, but generosity without clarity is an invitation to misunderstanding. When I finally spoke to my son again, the conversation was different from any we'd had before. I didn't accuse, I didn't shout. I explained how his decision affected me, not just financially, but emotionally. I told him that trust had been damaged and that rebuilding it would require honesty, not assumptions. He listened, but I could tell he was surprised. Not defensive, just surprised. It was as if he had never considered that my silence in the past didn't equal consent forever. That moment revealed something important. People don't push boundaries because they are malicious. They push because no one clearly marks where the boundary is. I had spent decades believing that love meant leaving doors open. What I learned instead was that open doors without guidance invite people to walk through without looking back. Boundaries don't close relationships. They define them. As uncomfortable as it was, this experience forced me to grow in ways comfort never had. I consulted professionals, I reorganized my finances, I made plans that didn't depend on anyone else's future choices. Each step restored a small piece of confidence I didn't realize I'd lost. Independence isn't isolation, it's preparation. And preparation brings peace that hope alone never can. Emotionally, I also had to confront my own role without drowning in blame. Regret can either teach or paralyze. I chose to let it teach. I acknowledged that my parenting style, rooted in sacrifice without discussion, had consequences. That doesn't mean I failed, it means I learned. Late, perhaps, but still in time to shape what came next. I noticed how this clarity changed the way I saw other families. I could see the unspoken expectations hovering in conversations. The quiet pressure disguised as tradition. I wanted to warn people, but I knew advice only lands when someone is ready. All I could do was live differently and speak honestly when asked. What surprised me most was the sense of relief that followed acceptance. Once I stopped pretending everything was fine, things actually became manageable. The fear of conflict had kept me silent for years, yet conflict handled calmly brought understanding instead of destruction. Not perfect understanding, but enough. If you're listening to this and feeling uncomfortable, that's not a sign to turn away. It's a signal to look closer. Ask yourself what assumptions you're carrying that haven't been tested yet. Ask what conversations you're avoiding because they feel awkward or unnecessary. Waiting doesn't make them easier, it makes them heavier. I didn't lose my son that day. Our relationship changed, yes, but change isn't always loss. Sometimes it's the removal of illusion. What remains afterward may be less idealized, but it's more real. And real relationships, even strained ones, are healthier than perfect ones built on silence. That call forced me to stop living on autopilot. It demanded that I engage with my own life intentionally, not as a supporting character in someone else's plans. Aging doesn't strip you of agency unless you surrender it quietly. I chose not to. As the weeks turned into months, the emotional dust settled enough for patterns to become visible. Distance has a way of clarifying things that closeness blurs. I could see how my life had slowly shifted from being lived to being managed, from active choice to passive expectation. I had believed that being a good parent meant staying in the background, never interfering, never insisting, always accommodating. What I failed to see was how that approach slowly erased me as a person with needs, limits, and a voice of my own. I began to understand that many parents confuse endurance with virtue. We wear sacrifice like a badge, convincing ourselves it proves love. But sacrifice without communication doesn't strengthen bonds, it weakens them. It teaches others that your comfort is optional, your limits negotiable, your future flexible. None of that is true, but if you never say otherwise, people act accordingly. That realization didn't make me angry anymore, it made me sober. I spent time reflecting on my own parents and the messages they passed down. They grew up in a world where survival demanded silence, needs were secondary, authority was rarely questioned. Love was shown through work, not words. I inherited those values without examining whether they still applied. Times changed, expectations changed, but I kept using old rules in a new world, assuming they would still protect me. They didn't. This clarity also reshaped how I viewed responsibility. I stopped seeing it as something owed to me and started seeing it as something I owed myself. Responsibility to plan realistically. responsibility to speak clearly, responsibility to stop outsourcing my sense of security to people who never agreed to carry it. That shift was uncomfortable, but it was also empowering. It returned ownership of my life to me. My conversations with my son became more grounded after that. We spoke less often, but with more intention. There were fewer assumptions, fewer emotional shortcuts. I no longer hinted. I stated. I no longer hoped he would read between the lines. I spoke directly. That alone reduced tension. Clarity is kinder than silence, even when it's difficult. I also noticed how society rarely prepares parents for this phase of life honestly. We talk about raising children endlessly, but almost never about releasing them properly. We celebrate independence in youth, then quietly resent it in adulthood when it inconveniences us. No one teaches you how to redefine purpose once your role changes. Many people fill that gap with expectation, and expectation left unchecked turns into disappointment. I refused to let disappointment define my later years. I began pursuing interests I had postponed, not because they were productive, but because they made me feel alive. I rebuilt routines that didn't revolve around waiting for phone calls or visits. I invested in friendships that were mutual, not hierarchical. That balance mattered. It reminded me that connection doesn't have to flow in one direction to be meaningful. What surprised me most was how this shift affected my sense of time. Days felt fuller, not because I was busier, but because I was present. When you stop waiting for validation or rescue from others, you start noticing what's already available. Time stops feeling like something being taken from you and starts feeling like something you reusing intentionally. I don't tell this story to paint my son as a villain or myself as a victim. Life isn't that simple. I tell it because it exposes a truth many people avoid until it's forced on them. Relationships don't run on love alone. They run on clarity, communication, and mutual agreement. When one of those is missing, even good intentions can cause harm. If you're a parent listening to this, don't wait for a crisis to start talking honestly. Ask questions, set expectations, make plans that don't rely on unspoken promises. If you're a child, don't assume, ask. Respect boundaries even when they aren't clearly stated yet. Silence isn't consent and love isn't a blank check. I learned all this later than I wish I had, but learning late is still learning. Growth doesn't have an expiration date unless you decide it does. At this stage of my life, I value peace over pride, clarity over comfort, truth over tradition. Those priorities didn't come naturally. They were earned through discomfort and reflection. That phone call didn't ruin my life, it reshaped it. It stripped away illusions I didn't realize I was living under. What remained was less romantic but far more stable. I stand on my own now, not because I have to, but because I choose to. And that choice, made consciously, is the most valuable thing I've reclaimed. I stopped viewing the future as something fragile that could be taken from me and started seeing it as something flexible that could still be shaped. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing where you stand, even if that place isn't comfortable. I wasn't rich in certainty, but I was rich in awareness, and that turned out to be far more useful. I knew what I could control and what I couldn't, and I stopped exhausting myself trying to manage the rest. I paid closer attention to how often people avoid hard truths because they fear emotional fallout. We tiptoe around conversations hoping silence will preserve peace, but silence rarely preserves anything. It just delays the moment when reality speaks louder. I had spent years believing that harmony required restraint, that love meant absorbing discomfort quietly. What I learned instead was that unspoken resentment doesn't disappear. It accumulates, and when it finally surfaces, it does so without mercy. My relationship with my son settled into something more honest, not perfect, not storybook, but real. We learned how to interact without hidden expectations shaping every exchange. There were limits now, clearly stated, and surprisingly, those limits made interactions easier. We both knew where responsibility began and ended. That clarity reduced tension more than any sacrifice ever had. I also noticed a change in how I saw myself. For a long time, my identity had been tied to usefulness. I rediscovered parts of myself that had been buried under obligation. Curiosity returned. Even ambition returned, though it looked different now. It wasn't about achievement, it was about experience. But they were mine. I wasn't waiting for permission or approval. I wasn't bargaining with the future. I was present, and presence has a way of restoring dignity no amount of reassurance ever can. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. Love without communication is fragile. Tradition without discussion is risky. Assumptions feel safe only until they're tested. Whether you're young or old, parent or child, clarity is an act of respect. It protects relationships more reliably than silence ever will. I know this message won't be comfortable for everyone. It challenges stories we like to believe about family, loyalty, and aging. But comfort isn't the goal, understanding is. I would rather you feel unsettled now than devastated later. I would rather you question expectations than be crushed by them. Time moves forward whether we prepare or not. Stability doesn't come from control. The call that once felt like a betrayal now feels like a turning point. Not because the pain disappeared, but because it forced truth into the open. Truth is uncomfortable, but it's also grounding. It removes the guesswork. It gives you something solid to stand on. From there, you can build honestly or you can walk away with clarity. Both are better than pretending. If you're listening and recognizing yourself in this, don't wait. Have the conversations you're postponing. Look at your assumptions. Make plans that respect both your independence and your relationships. Don't let love become leverage or silence become permission. You don't need to harden your heart to protect yourself. You need to open your mouth. I'm older now. I won't pretend otherwise, but I'm also wiser in ways I never expected to be. Not because life treated me gently, but because I finally listened when it spoke clearly. The future may still be uncertain,